you were a big town trade unionist in the 70s and the 80s, which would have located you within the mass democratic movement at the time in the left.
Mm.
So the chaps that would have been RDP advocates, the chaps that would have been passionate about the Freedom Charter, but within the trade union movement, you belonged even to the intellectual, I think, maybe let's say ideological frame that almost didn't want an alliance, as it were, with you wanted an independent trade union organization, as it were. And South African bands, political parties, COSATU obviously is formed, and I am interested, maybe in just that as an introductory way, before the unbanning, just you mapping for us those trade union days and trade union years for you.
Well, it's we actually doing a project now, working with the Mbeki Foundation, trying to record that period from 1970 onwards, where you have a very significant rebirth of trade unions. And it's brought together in an interesting way by the level of industrialization in South Africa. So workers were going through difficult times with wages. Many of the more experienced and senior leaders were coming off Robben Island. In the student movement, where I was, and as a university lecturer, we began mobilizing, and we decided to mobilize around workers. And that was the influence of intellectuals like Rick Turner, Eddie Webster, and many others who had studied Marxism abroad and then come back and become lecturers. So they influenced many of us to study seriously economic history, Marxist theory, neoliberal theory. I lectured in economics. So that combination, I think, was a very strong one. It was a very interesting combination between workers in the workplace and experienced political leaders and young student activists. We want to record it because I think it was very important. Some important strategic decisions were made, particularly the structure of the unions. So the new unions were structured in their constitutions slightly differently from the traditional old unions of the past, which were based very much on the British model of artisanal unions. But the new unions, we incorporated shop stewards, so elected representatives in the factory were key players, and the whole governance structure of the union movement started from the shop floor. And I think that was important. We also then took some important decisions that we should be industrial unions, and then we worked towards unity. Slowly, smaller unions started coming together across the country, so that by 1979, we could start FOSATU, Federation of South African Trade Unions. In 1985, we could start the...
You were working in already as a general secretary by the time FOSATU was formed in 79.
I was secretary of a thing called the Trade Union Advisory and Coordinating Council. And then I became the secretary of FOSATU, Secretary General of FOSATU. And then I moved to the education department of FOSATU. Joe Foster, old friend of mine, is still around. I'm seeing him later today. He became the Secretary General of FOSATU. And then we had many years of unity talks and then formed COSATU.
In 85.
Yeah.
But within COSATU, within those debates about the Freedom Charter, ideologically, where were you? Were you with the NUMSA CWIU side that were in the main, most of the time, reluctant to a Congress outright politics, or were you with NUM?
No, I think there's a bit of a legend that there were Workerists. There were most of the leadership of COSATU and FOSATU. The position they took was that the Freedom Charter by itself, or what we could see of ANC policy, wasn't clear enough on the role of the working class. We were a little bit critical of the South African Communist Party as being somewhat dogmatic. We were more influenced by left-wing movements like Solidarity in Poland, or the Lula, who was here recently.
Yes, in Brazil.
The workers' movement in Brazil. So it was not that we were opposed to the ANC. We said that we need to have a much clearer program that would incorporate workers. We tried to encapsulate that in a speech that Joe Foster gave. It's just called the Joe Foster speech, which talked about the need for a strong worker movement. But I can't remember when, but we took a decision at the very high level of COSATU that we would work with the ANC, that we would... It was fairly difficult. COSATU was still in existence, and we had COSATU, so it was a working relationship. And we established contact with the top leadership, including President Mbeki of the ANC. So it was really, the position was that we needed a more comprehensive program of action, which the main drivers behind the Reconstruction and Development Program was COSATU, because we wanted more detail, and we drafted it with ANC comrades. I mean, Tito, Mboweni, Trevor, Manuel, people in COSATU. We drafted it, and the unions. We did a lot of research. I mean, the Industrial Strategy Project. We had researchers from all over the world. We were very lucky. We got experts from developing countries. So we put a lot of effort into researching the work. And this is why we want to record that, because people sometimes just look at the legend, there were Workerists opposed to the ANC. Is not the position.
Yeah. I did get recently interact with the work of the Economic Transformation Committee of the ANC.
Yes.
Which by the transition years included these characters like Tito Mboweni you are mentioning, but it had been initially chaired by Max Sisulu.
Yes.
Then later on integrated Tito as well as Trevor Manuel.
Yes.
Were you in the Economic Transformation Committee in the early 90s?
Now what we had was, there was a group in London, Ben Fine and Lawrence Harris. No, that came later.
That came later.
Merck came later. That was also preparing economic policy. We had in COSATU Industrial Strategy Project. The ANC internally didn't have much on the research side, but then that Economic Transformation Committee was formed. Max was the first chair. And then COSATU took a decision that 20 of the top leaders would work with the ANC in preparation for government. And we were not on the ANC's economic transfer, but we worked with them. So, which we need to record again, because each of the economic ministers that went into the new government had a small, we call it the Yellow Book. It was a small program of action for each minister to follow in the first 5 years. And that was prepared by the ETC. So Trevor, Tito, Trevor had been actively involved in the scenario planning down here in Cape Town. I forget its name, but there was a very good and active program of building scenarios, and Trevor had been very actively involved in that. Tito, as you know, was an economist. So we worked together with the ETC. So That must have started around about 1992 or so. I think, too, people forget there was a thing called the National Economic Forum, which Derek Keyes set up. So we had to work together in preparing for that. There was a transformation committee between the ANC and government, which Trevor was and Max and others were on. So there was a lot of cooperation and coordination.
Yeah.
With slight tensions, because we were pushing the union positions quite strongly. And rightly so, the ANC comrades said, but the union position can't be the only one. There are other things too we got to look at. But I think it was a very rich and healthy debate, which led to the Reconstruction and Development Program.
Yes. Yeah, I'm pushing you to recall this history to arrive at a specific question. I mean, you are a product of workers' movements, a product of specifically the trade union movement within the mass democratic movement. And that is how 1994 for you begins. You are a trade unionist. You had not ran a single municipality. You had not run any sophisticated government. So you were perfectly in the left in the ANC as it begins this journey. I want to ask you about, where did that 1996 class project concept originate from, and what was its thesis? Because 1994, you are the first deputy minister of finance to a minister of finance in the government of national unity who is not ANC. And you've just tracked for us these debates. You have been part of the economic policy formulation and thinking leading towards the adoption of the RDP. But isn't it true that at some point somebody said somewhere and said 1996 class project, and I suspect that would have been either your very strong comrades from the 80s and the early 90s in the debates of towards the RDP. Do you recall what was the 1996 class project about?
Look, the unions, we had done a massive amount of research. Dave Lewis and others, Stephen Gelb, had led big research projects. We also had the chance to go and talk to people in the early 90s. Myself, Jay Naidu, a guy called Bernico, who's no longer here, went and met Lula. So we had long discussions with the Brazilian unions, who were also thinking about economic policy. We had long discussions with the Australian trade unions and the Labour Party. We had access to the Canadians and the Canadian unions, and we had access to the Scandinavian trade unions. So we had a very clear picture of economic policy. And we realized too that we could not disengage from the world economy. That the South African economy was in a very precarious position. It could either collapse or it could grow. So we had a well worked out approach to the economy. When I was Deputy Minister of Finance, Trevor and I, with Chris Stolz, who was went abroad to see if we could raise South African bonds. So we were exposed to the financial markets. We had to argue South Africa's case in Britain, Italy, the United States. So we got a pretty clear picture of what was happening in what we then called globalization, this rush towards a much more integrated global economy. And as I say, we were heavily involved in the negotiations to form the World Trade Organization. So I would say that that core of the ETC grouping, which as I said, was some Unionists, some ANC, had a clear picture. There were those who were not in the ETC, mainly in the Communist Party. And I think it was actually Jeremy Cronin, a good comrade of ours, who they argued that these measures that we were putting in, like gear and macroeconomic stability were sellouts to capitalism. And we said, no, they just acknowledge the reality of power. And if we don't do them, we'll be in a worse position. And I think, of course, it's our position, but the transition was managed very smoothly. You can see many other countries have not managed to make that transition at all. So that was what the debate was about. It was people who argued that we were not following the path to socialism, and the fact that we were taking international capital, that we introduced quite tight fiscal control, because the Brazilians in particular told us, don't allow inflation to go mad. If you allow inflation, this thing about it, you can, what's called pump prime an economy, they said is false. And we could see it. We could talk to the Brazilian economists and see that the effects of rampant inflation, which Brazil had in the early 90s, was devastating to an economy. And the Brazilian and South African economies have got a lot in common. Both are quite industrialized in certain sectors. So we learned a lot from there, and we learned a lot from Australia, the Labour Party. So it was a debate between, which you see very often in politics, those in government responsible for actually trying to manage the situation, and those who had a political position but were not responsible for managing the situation. So it was, for me, debates like that also are useful because it keeps everyone on their toes, So, but the reason, as I say, we're trying to record it is, as I'm trying to do now, give much more detail of what happened and why we did certain things,
And 1996 is definitively the end of GNU with the adoption of the Constitution. Specifically, de Klerk walks out of the GNU, of the then GNU. I should actually qualify that. You're the first Minister of Trade and Industry, and you have to rewrite, so to speak, South Africa's trade integration, global integration, trade with the world. In many ways, South Africa is facing the same, if not as worse, problems of having to confront a world that is shifting, with the United States and Donald Trump having launched a catastrophic, rather chaotic trade war. Just before we go to Donald Trump, take us through those first years of reintegrating South Africa into the world trade.
Well,
because it had been isolated because of sanctions, boycotts.
I think that was probably one of the most important strategic decisions we took. And it came not from a theoretical debate, but from the research we did. So what we could see is that those countries who had successfully transformed towards industrialization, like South Korea, Singapore, Japan, we watched closely and realized that you can't industrialize at high cost. You have to have a strategy, and these are complex strategies too. So we realized we're going to have to engage with the world trade system. As Unionists, we had seen what happens to industries that are protected by high tariffs but can't compete actually. We saw this in the auto industry, in most of and this is where NUMSA played a very strong role, because we could see it in the engineering industry. So we were very clear in going into government that we would enter in a managed process, the world trade system, and that although we would protect industries, that protection level had to drop because they had to become more efficient. And we had to have strategies for each industry because not each industry is the same. We put a lot of effort into auto industry. We put a lot of effort into the defense industry because these were our main manufacturing sectors and very advanced manufacturing. So we then entered the negotiations with the National Party government into the WTO. And we took a very interesting decision because the structure of the WTO, I won't go into detail, but there's a distinction between a developed economy, developing economies and least developed economies. The provisions of the agreement apply slightly differently to each. We took a brave decision. We declared ourselves developed. We didn't want to fall in the developing category for a whole range of reasons.
Such as?
It allowed you to adjust too slowly, in our view. It gave you too much space to do things. You had to enter into the industrial trade system and manufacturing system. So that's a very brief answer to it would be a much more complex answer. And we could watch the effect of the provisions for developing countries, put no pressure on them. What we had learned from many of the economic advisors we had, including people like the Bank of England governor, but we had a fascinating meeting, myself, Trevor, Manuel, and Tito Mboweni. We met a man called Sir Leon Britton. He was at that time the EU's trade commissioner. And he met us at a hotel in Johannesburg. So that was the ETC sort of troika. And he said, why don't you guys negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU? So we said, you're nuts. What are you talking about? He said, no. He said, let me tell you. And this is, okay, he said, if you do that, it will keep your governments and your industry disciplined. Because the trouble with governments that don't have trade agreements, they chop and change. When we talk about Trump, we'll see that he's got some problems. So we looked at it again and we thought about it. And eventually we said, this might make some sense. And that's where it took us 4 or 5 years. I think eventually we got the agreement in 1999. But that taught us a lot about trade negotiation. And then we negotiated the free trade agreement with SADC and renegotiated the customs union agreement. So we got tremendous exposure to the global trade system. And we worked, and we didn't drop our tariffs too fast, but we dropped them. And that was also people were saying, you see, you're liberalizing your economy. We said, no, we're putting in an inducement to greater efficiency, which you need. So we managed that transition, I think, very, very well. The EU trade agreement is now a thing called the EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. But it's been a very successful agreement. We trade almost the same amount. We export to Europe, we import from them. So it's been very useful for our industries. It's helped a lot of them.
What was the key tenets of the industrial strategy at the time? The big assessment of South Africa today is that it's actually been deindustrializing, a factor that often is the reason given for this massive inability to solve massive unemployment. But what were the key tenets of industrial strategy at the time?
Well, firstly, that contention that we've deindustrialized is not correct. South Africa's manufacturing capacity has expanded. Not enough, which I'll come back to later. So yes, it is one of our challenges, is to industrialize faster. But our manufacturing sector survived pretty well. And the key tenets were to focus on strategic industries. So we spent a lot of effort on our automotive industry because we got that industry by chance. It wasn't that we were a big market and they were coming here. So we had to work through, and we put up with the previous government a thing called the Motor Industry Task Group. We had task groups on the clothing and textile industry. Sadly, were not as effective then, although now we slowly clawing back a little bit. But we focused, and we looked at defense, because defense was producing some very sophisticated equipment, including things like Rafale helicopter. And so we wanted to ensure Denel survived and manufactured. So the general industrial policy was to try and protect it, but there's no single measure you can do for a whole of industry. You've got to have, like now Minister Patel, once again, to try and revive our industrial policy, went and put in the master plans for different sectors. So industrial policy is complex. It's you need specific ones and it depends what your resources are. So as you've seen recently in this G20, I'm very pleased to see that we stress this need to beneficiate our critical minerals. So one of South Africa's great resource endowments, which is exceptional in the world, is our critical mineral endowment. But we mustn't export the raw material only. We've got to make sure we beneficiate it. So many proposals have been made to do that in the short term and do things. So industrial policy needs to look at the industry and the context. When we were looking at industrial policy in the 1990s, we were doing it in the context of globalization. Everyone thought this thing called globalization is going to carry on forever. Now we're doing it in the context of a completely different context. Where supply chains are changing. There's what they call inshoring. So you have to analyze the global context, your national context, your resource endowment, the specific industry that you're dealing with, what your existing capacity is, and do policies from that, which is being done now. Sometimes we might say too slowly, but the focus of the government has tended to be heavily on investment, whereas we think it should go back a little bit more to the policy for the sector rather than just specific investment. But that's happening. I mean, being very significant investments in auto, clothing and textile. We've got serious challenges to rescue our steel, what's called long product steels. We've got some serious problems in certain cities like Goodyear closing. But these sort of challenges happen in every economy. And you have to have a Department of Trade and Industry that's watching these problems all the time and adjusting to the changes in the world economy.
What has the United States disrupted for South Africa from a trade agreements point of view? I know AGOA, but if you were the minister today, how would you navigate that?
Actually, the minister, exactly as the minister is doing, I would do the same now. There have been discussions, and the minister and his team have taken advice and asked what the history of AGOA was and that. I'm afraid, unfortunately for the Americans, they've disrupted us very little. They think they have, but they haven't. And there's some good reasons for that. Firstly, this strategy of protectionism, the last time it was sort of tried seriously by countries led to the Great Depression. So this is why...
1930s.
Yeah. That's when the Americans and others tried to protect and disrupt trade relationship. And that was such a serious experience that led to the confirmation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1948, which led to subsequently in 1993 to the World Trade Organization. And that's worth mentioning at this stage. We were involved in talking to the Russians and the Chinese because they only entered the WTO when we were there in 94. So we had a lot of discussions with the Chinese and the Russians. And they, like us, realized that it's far better to be in the multilateral trade system than to be isolated. So both came in, and we've just seen, I think, the great achievement of South Africa at the G20 was a strong reaffirmation of multilateralism. And you're talking about massive economies. You're talking about the global South, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, India, China. So the majority of the world's big economies are committed to multilateralism. And the EU, which was interesting because the EU a year or two back was slipping. They was trying to side with America. So America's actions have alienated the EU and forced them back into the multilateral system, which I think is a very important improvement. So Trump's policy, if you're hitting out at everybody, you don't quite know what the effect will be. If you watch the Chinese they slapped them on the face, and the Chinese just put tariffs on Americans using the WTO, not using unilateral actions, using the WTO mechanism. The Europeans have been hit hard. So if you take something like auto, they put tariffs on everybody. So European automotive exports to America didn't suddenly become cheaper. They also had the same tariff as us. And then certain our key exports to the United States are unusual. So automotive exports are not determined by market forces. They're determined by the pattern of production and trade that the big auto companies have. So they make a decision to supply Mercedes from South Africa or BMWs from South Africa. The Americans will now pay a higher price. Yes, it will probably have some effect on dropping the demand, but it's not that someone's replacing us. So we're not differentially hurt or exceptionally hurt. And this is what people do. Trump's doing the same to lots of countries all over the world, India, China, all his trading partners. Yeah. Now, his strategy is to try and retreat into a stronger America. Whether he succeeds or not, we'll have to see. But for us, it's not really problematic. We've been able to shift already some of our agricultural exports to a better market. So the strategy our government has taken has been very sensible. Just negotiate, check. Often we've had to send more experienced negotiators in because it's clear that in the early stages we didn't quite understand what the Americans were saying. So when we sent more experienced negotiators in, when Minister Tao went and spoke to them, and we realized, okay, they've got some valid points here. They were raising certain valid points here.
Such as?
That South Africa wasn't processing things quickly. We didn't seem to be following up on anything. We just used AGOA. We weren't talking to them about developing further partnerships. So they had some, and then a range of small technical issues. We didn't explain that what's that, Starlink or something that wanted to invest here, that for multinational companies, we have a slightly different system in BEE. You're not compelled to have black ownership at all. Like in the auto, we don't have black ownership of Toyota. Or BEE doesn't apply. It applies, but you can replace ownership with what's called an equity equivalent. So we explained that to them and said there's no barrier to entry for your investments. We explained the Ford investment, which is one of the biggest Ford investments outside of America. Yeah? So we weren't explaining many of the things they were saying.
What is the trouble with the Americans? Have they also experienced fundamental change in relation to institutional memory? How come they've been in this relationship and suddenly with over 600 companies operating in South Africa, how come they've not understood those conditions? Is it because they've had their own administrative super changes in terms of personnel that was not experienced?
I can't say exactly what is happening there, but it looks to me like they've got a strategy. They want to retreat, reestablish a lot of their manufacturing capacity, which is weakened. The way they're doing it is to sort of hit out at everybody and see what they get. So the trouble with that is that it violates the multilateral trade system because you're doing all these unilateral actions, changing tariffs left, right, and center. So whether it will work, my assessment would be that they've got not much out of it at this point. If you watch in South Africa, our biggest single export to America is the platinum group metals. These are very, very important metals. And there's no duty, no
you
tariff.
Can't just go and take them from elsewhere.
Yeah, you can't. And some of the most important strategic platinum group metals, we're the biggest supplier in the world. And we're exporting processed metal, we're not exporting ore. So the reality is they can't just break off easily with South Africa. AGOA is important, useful for us, but it would not destroy our trading system if they took us out. In fact, the original agreement, as we explained to them, was that we were going to leave it after 15 years. But then we negotiated an extension because it actually helps America and helps us. So I think that they're trying to implement a long-term strategy using these disruptive instruments. So it's not that they're ignorant of the relationship. They know what they're doing. They want to see what we give out. And our government has been very good, I think, by not responding in a panicky way. Just sit and wait and see what happens. But we're making suggestions to them. There are all sorts of things can improve. We're trying to improve our understanding of what they want, explaining our position more carefully to them. This stuff about genocide and all that's just political maneuvering by Trump, that's his political style, is to use hyperbole and provocation to see what comes out.
I saw that following Ramaphosa's refusal to hand over at the session of G20 and do it at DERCO offices and all of that, he has retaliated that all aid to South Africa must be immediately stopped, and definitively said South Africa is not invited to G20 next year.
Has he said that?
Yes, he said that. That's the statement that has come out clear. I know there's nothing trade, because then it's about aid. He had already stopped aid, and people were worried about, healthcare, and there was a proper government response to that, look, South Africa can survive, actually. Our worry mostly should be particularly our neighbors, that this aid in healthcare may cause inevitably overwhelming strain on South Africa's health system. So it looks like he's back there. What's the worst that they could do from a trade perspective? Because he's looking for vengeance.
Nothing. We can do more damage to them than they can do to us.
Break that down for us. Is it platinum group metals?
If they block trade, a lot of that trade is coming from American investments in South Africa. They can't. If they want to block the platinum group metals, they're welcome to. That's something we can sell anywhere. So they can't. That's the harsh truth. They can't. At risk of hurting their own industries quite badly. So when they start doing the calculations, they'll see that if we block trade from South Africa, we're damaging U.S. investments very heavily, and big investments. So from our point of view, the trade is beneficial to both parties. It's one of the few African countries where they trade manufactured products. We exchange manufactured products. It's a mature, good trade relationship that we should keep in the interests of both economies. It will be difficult for them to break it immediately. Another important decision we took in the early 90s is that we would not become an aid-dependent economy. So South Africa can be very proud of that. We resisted IMF and World Bank loans, and we're not aid-dependent. Aid is a very, very small part of our economy. Blocking the anti-aid stuff, we can replace that money without any serious problems to our fiscal structure. So there's a limit. It's like for America to think they can hurt India or China or Russia, they're dreaming. These economies are much more advanced now. They're highly industrialized. America's a nice market to have, but not essential anymore. So, yes, Trump will maybe hit back. He may provoke by saying he won't invite South Africa. Well, the other G20 members may not agree with that. This is not a dictatorship. This is a troika. So these provocative sort of acts, the advice I would give our government is don't be provoked. But they know that. They're not being provoked. They keep a steady head. President's keeping a steady head.
Do you think he would have acted in that way regardless of what Ramaphosa did with the request for a handover at the last session of G20? You think he was going to act anyway?
Yeah, probably doing it. It's just a maneuver. I would say, in my assessment, America got quite a severe defeat in this whole G20 saga because they didn't disrupt it at all by their behavior. It was one of the most successful of the G20 meetings. But as I say, strategically, I think the fundamental importance of it is unification of the global south and the EU with Russia, China, India. That is a gigantic economic bloc. And its very clear, unequivocal commitment to the multilateral trade system is a very important moment. So that means that all the big trading partners, China, are not going to start doing all sorts of unilateral deals with America, which is, I think, what he hoped. The strategy was that there would be a whole lot of bilateral deals with countries who had given, depending how strong they were. But in fact, all the big economies are giving him nothing.
Let's then turn to the East, as it used to be called, East Asia, Russia, as you put it, together with the continent. Already, by country basis, South Africa's largest trading partner is China. But these blocks, it would be Europe. But let's South Africa-China relations from the ambition of industrialization point of view. What are the prospects there of that relationship yielding for South Africa the growth of local manufacturing?
I think very good indeed. You see, one has to understand the longer-term process of industrialization. So I'll use auto, which is an industry I know better, but if you see, the auto industry starts in America and Europe. So if you take a company like Ford, it grows in Detroit, and this becomes bigger and bigger, and it produces more and more motor cars. But eventually the economics start to work against that structure. Because, as Japan found too, if I'm trying to, in one place in America, produce 1 million cars, that's a gigantic industrial complex. And I now start to get the diseconomies of scale, not the economies of scale. And then I'm exporting air. If I export a car, half of it's air, taking up space with nothing. So it became clear, which the Americans started to see in the 30s and 40s, about 30 years after their industry had grown. They began looking for offshore production sites. They come to South Africa through political circumstance. But the Japanese get moving in the 20, 30 years after the Americans. But then they start moving in the 60s and 70s, looking for offshore production sites. Because it makes far more sense to distribute your manufacturing not every economy will do it. You choose locations that are close to markets, that have got infrastructure. This is where South Africa benefited. Now, China's industrialization has been the greatest, even more than the Soviet Union, in a 30, 40-year period. Yeah. So now the Chinese, imagine their auto production really only starts 30 or 40 years ago.
Yes.
Now they're reaching scale. They were such a big market, they weren't so interested in exports to begin with. Now exports are quite useful for them to have. But they will follow the same strategy as the others. They'll start, as we've seen now, that it started out as a bit of a mess.
Let's zoom in a bit there, because there is a crisis. Second time it's hitting, crisis of overproduction. Earlier, maybe about 15, 20 years ago, these were steel factories, but they were state-owned, and the government just simply shut down operations because they were just stockpiling and stockpiling in China. But the auto sector, it's private players. And they're looking for what would be called dumping. They want to bring a whole finished car for at least the next 4, 5, maybe in some instances, 10 years. And they are producing exceptionally cheapest cars in the world. I don't know if they're quality, but they're cheap. as cheap as $8,000. And this is where they are. If they are negotiating, an interesting example is precisely the auto sector. If they are negotiating, if they're on a table, they don't want to open local manufacturing yet. They want a deal that says, we want to dump for the next 5 years because they've got so much that they have produced. They want to export finished product as much as possible at a cheaper price. And what it might do is change the dynamics of the auto sector here, because all the cheap cars, if they're from China, and they're coming as finished products. What does that dynamic do if you are sitting on the table with them and you are looking for local manufacturing?
That's the legend that you do, but it's not the facts.
Okay.
So we've had the same issues in the 90s. Big economies can produce vehicles cheaper. You're too young maybe to remember that people used to refer to Japanese cars exactly the same way as they now refer to Chinese.
To the Chinese, yeah.
So the fact is that that's wrong. Basically, the Chinese auto industry is a modern one, highly efficient. In fact, now taking technology leads when it comes to new energy vehicles. The reason they export is not because it's crucial for them. Their domestic market is so big that they don't need to. But it's useful in terms of earning foreign exchange. So for many of the Chinese companies are a mixture. They report to what's called SASIC, State Agency for Shareholder Investment. So they're complex companies. But if they were dumping, we've got remedies. We hit them with the anti-dumping action. So far, ITAC, our trade commission, haven't picked up dumping. Yes, they're cheap and competitive because of the size of their production. But we've already seen now that they're starting to put manufacturing plants here. Bike, which was sitting doing nothing for a while, is now doing a proper CKD plant. There are a few others that are coming in too on the NEVs, because the economics of investing, putting a manufacturing plant where there's good manufacturing capacity is much better than exporting the cheap vehicle. So I think that the prospects for partnership with China are good. We do have to watch closely. And we have a system in the auto industry, but in other industries it's more difficult, that makes it difficult to dump the vehicle. But it does require vigilance on our part. So there you're correct. If they dump, it's our fault, not their fault. So but there's changes. China's investing in manufacturing in Morocco as well.
Yes.
It's investing in Egypt. So they're following a very similar path to the other industrial powers like the United States, Germany, etc. So it's we must just manage the negotiation properly. Our relations with China have always been very good, and they understand the need for partnership.
Let's go to, I would say, the biggest scandal of G20 is the Europeans' insistence on just transition. And South Africa, like the rest of the African continent, I was reading a report that came out a couple of days ago by, I think it's UNESCO, on poverty. And it focused on the continent. Part of what they say is about 600 million people in the continent don't have access to electricity. And there's actually a scarier thing that there are 2 million deaths a year in Africa that result out of unsafe cooking methods. Africa hasn't had an energy to transit from. Industrially, they still need to make the first transition, the first industrial transition, which is to actual electricity. And these chaps of Europe, and this is a big theme of the declaration, which everybody is hailing as positive and all of that, is this theme of a just transition. And they're putting money into it. South Africa's energy problem is only becoming, getting out of the woods, trying to become stable. But if you're going to grow this economy, you have to fix energy supply. It has to be in excess, it has to be cheap. Not just for household, for actual industrial activity. What is the assessment, your fossil fuels, departure from your fossil fuels, in this case for us coal, for the rest of the continent it's oil, gas. But Europe's relationship, Europe's slate, Europe's condition, if we put it that way, of trade relationship with the continent is that you've got to abandon fossil fuels.
Some of them might put it like that, but I think the reality is that they can't say that. And like South Africa, we've told them, you don't tell us something stupid like that. I think a lot of people don't quite understand the interesting change in dynamics. You see, the EU is pushing a just change towards non-fossil fuels. But the EU has got a fundamental structural energy crisis now. So where is it going to get that energy from? It's created a political mess and cut off its security of supply from Russian gas. Its coal mines are depleted. It's got no access to gas. It's closed its nuclear stations. It doesn't have the raw material for nuclear fuel. So yes, they took the lead that we need to change to protect the climate, but their ability to carry out an actual change in their energy process is very low. So, we in Africa, and I think South Africa, we understand this. When they put pressure on us, we've got far more pressure than they have. So there was an important agreement in the sidelines of the G20, was the one between EU and South Africa on beneficiating our critical minerals. Because actually Europe needs reliable, strong partners. If it wants to carry out its industrial transition to greener manufacturing, it needs someone to partner with. And South Africa is probably the best partner it could have, because we've got the minerals they haven't. And Africa's got the minerals they haven't. So they got to form partnerships. So yes, they will be pushing hard that you must do this, but I think our government hasn't been confused. We know what our strengths and weaknesses are. We've negotiated the pace. As I say, the amount of finance they're giving us is peanuts. We could raise that finance elsewhere too. It's useful, but it's not fundamental, you see. This notion that everything South Africa has to do depends on some foreign aid is a completely false one. We've got a strong enough financial system. Most of our investment is from South Africa, it's not from abroad.
But the attitude...
It's a bit...
Well, the attitude of... let's not say attitude. Our electricity minister, he's leading the energy policy of South Africa at the moment. I mean, they're talking about solar plants. They're speaking about windmills. They're speaking about turning coal-powered stations into green extraction of energy, and the production of energy reduces from 1,000 to 400 megawatts. It seems to me that are you not perhaps being too hopeful about South Africans and their actions on the energy space, specifically the state actors, that maybe they are buying more than we think they are? No, they are not.
I think we're doing very, very well. Look, South Africa is a completely different position to Europe. We're as a large economy, we're probably the most energy secure future that you can imagine. So what have we got? We've got capacity for nuclear. We've got not little bits, but the main supply of fuel for our nuclear, because you need certain fuels, minerals for the fuel. We've got a strong grid. We've got lots of coal. We've got access to various types of gas if we need it, and our neighbors can give it to us. So we've got no shortage. We're not dependent on Nigerian oil or Middle Eastern oil or anything. So what is real is that you must start making adjustments. You cannot continue your energy system with the current rate of emission. So any sensible long-term economy like the Chinese, the Russians, everyone's making adjustments to their system. They're not just sitting there and letting it carry on like before. But we're doing it at our pace. So we can make certain changes for coal. We're lucky. We're probably one of the best countries in the world for solar. Wind, a little bit less. But those things are not going to play the key role. The key role is our base energy, which is going to be a mixture of coal declining, nuclear will have to grow significantly, and we could probably bring in gas, which is a little bit cleaner. So I think what we're doing is making the necessary adjustments. This is not pressure from the EU. This is we've been planning this for a long time. So the changes to coal, the planning for nuclear, even in my time, early 2000s, we had begun planning for this long ago. We knew we had to make an adjustment. You can't be as dependent as we are on coal. But you can do lots of things. The reason why Medupi and Kusile were so expensive is they are what are called supercritical coal stations. What that means is that as the emissions leave those big chimneys, you heat it and burn the particulates. So that's a whole new technological addition to a coal-fired power station to reduce the level of emissions. So there's been a move towards this, which is all sensible economies are doing it. Europe's problem is that its base supply of energy materials and the generating system is now problematic for them. So it's a challenge. That they take a position on just transition. They always like this. We used to be lectured on free trade endlessly in the 1990s. When you sat to the EU, you just listened to bloody free trade all the time. The Americans, free trade, WTO, free trade. Yeah. Now, of course, they've changed. So I think in international trade and economic relations, you must assess things on your real strength. There are far too many legends that go around in international trade theory. There's been a lot of effort put into, by the Americans in particular, to try to discredit the Chinese industrialization process or its products. But we had the same when Japan grew. So we must do our own homework, follow our own path, and do it in the context that we've shown so successfully at the G20. By being prepared to work with everyone.
And for competitive manufacturing for South Africa, what are the immediate fortunes in manufacturing where South Africa is definitely competitive at a global scale and should immediately capitalize?
Well, all agro industry, we're competitive. Obviously, I think the area of greatest prospect is for South Africa to become a leading green manufacturing economy. So, and that's where a lot of us are trying to say to government, give that priority, because that's a transition in your energy system and in your manufacturing system. But my own strong viewpoint is we're talking about building infrastructure, which is correct. But we must follow the Chinese model. What China did was it built massive infrastructure, but it manufactured the equipment. Now South Africa has got the manufacturing capacity to make that equipment. This is why making sure that we do not lose what's called the long steel product, because that's what's used in infrastructure. So we've got to make absolutely certain that plant doesn't close, because it shouldn't close.
ArcelorMittal.
Yeah, it shouldn't close. South Africa's no reason we should be closing that plant. So we must manufacture the equipment for our green manufacturing. And we've got the minerals to do it. We've got the capacity to do it. as we've been looking into this, we found that there's a surprising capacity for South Africa to do very advanced processing of our minerals. So these are fantastic opportunities, and we mustn't allow ourselves to miss that opportunity. We've got to make certain we can do these things. I think we're on the right track. It would be nice if we could move a bit faster, but we are on the right track, and the auto is important. I think we made some mistakes by not paying attention to some of our aircraft production that we were doing in the 2000s.
Yes.
We made a mistake with the pebble bed, trying to revive that. Because if we had kept those things, we would be in an excellent position now for our advanced manufacturing. But mistakes are made. So it's
you're more hopeful than a lot of people I come across at your age.
You see, I've been part of the actual building. If you wanted to see a bad situation, you should have been around in 1985. And then look, I say to people, when you looked at 1985, the world was, was South Africa, high costs of production, industry, yes, but a world which was globalizing massively. We were falling behind. We've been isolated. Our manufacturing capacity was low. The auto industry could have left any minute. So we faced much tougher things, and we could overcome it.
Maybe the final question is where we started. Rick Turner is not mentioned a lot, and he was a big figure alongside Steve Biko, at least for the chaps of NUSAS in the left, the chaps that you were mentioning earlier, who were in the workers' committees that ultimately led to the 73 strikes in Durban and the early unions. Very, very renowned Marxist, as it were. Maybe as a closing question, how much and what precise impact did he have on you?
He taught us to think and said analysis is the key, not dogma. So he was a very thinking Marxist. And the other thing, we used to have sessions with Pravin Gordon, Mohammed, a whole lot of us in the basement of the University of Natal, where under Rick's guidance, Mike Kirkwood and others under Rick's, we had to read Habermas, Kierkegaard,
Althusser,
Marx. If you hadn't read all 3 volumes of Capital, don't even come to the seminar. So that's what he taught us. You read the stuff, you don't mouth off with dogma.
Were you ever with him in those meetings with Steve Biko?
No. I went to his house many, many times because he used to write lots of stuff for us, for the Labour Bulletin, and we used to talk a lot.
Yes.
So I worked with him closely for a long, long time. And then other left-wing people came in, Michael Newpin, Eddie Webster. But they taught us to...
Peter Hudson.
They taught us... Well, he was more our age student,
Yeah. Was Eddie older than you?
But a little bit.
Yeah, Eddie... I mean, come on. I thought Eddie was in your generation.
No. He was a bit...
He was a bit older.
Yeah, he was a bit older.
Okay. Interesting.
He was a bit older. And then the other thing that the unions, which I'll always be... The unions taught me was... firstly, the power of collective action, but also that to organize is hard work, and you've got to listen to people and pull them together.
How do you rate the chaps that were so critical of gear and defeated you people at Polokwane, and they took over the ranks? Did they really abandon the 1996 class project in your assessment?
What they did was to take over and do bugger all. And you saw what happened. You see it collapsed. They had no... This is the difference between the dogmatic position and the actual position. So when they came in, it was just disorganization. So things started collapsing. I mean, there was no radical economic transformation. If you can try and show me what that was, whereas with gear and other things you can show, we had macro stability. We achieved our targets. Our target was to stabilize the fiscal system and get a primary surplus. These targets were achieved, as that race relations guy has shown. But after that, we had rhetoric, but no action. Well, there was a lot of action, but doing the wrong things.
Alec Erwin, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
I'll keep tabs on the trade negotiations.
Yeah, you must.
Hopefully, when we meet again,
we've got good
these targets we are
negotiators there.
talking about in relation to trade might be different.
Yeah.
But thanks very much.
Thank you.
Peter.